Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to continue my series on adapting the fighting fantasy rules to a Twine game using the sword and planet subgenre of science fiction to inspire the setting and plot. So, as you can see here, I have obviously started a game and I've gotten to a point where a new thing has happened, a thing that we haven't had code for yet. We can see that it says the hunter-gatherers present you with a feathered staff of the same design you saw when you first came to the camp. And if we look in the left-hand sort of character sheet, I suppose, that we have in the sidebar over here, you can see that we have feathered staff sort of listed as a thing that the character is carrying or in possession of. It is in capital letters just because that's the tradition in fighting fantasy books, that they tend to put items in capital letters. I guess so that the reader knows, oh, this is sort of the name that the thing will be referred to, I guess. Or to remind you that this is an item and therefore you have to write it down, and you might be asked whether you have it later. But anyway, for whatever reason, that seems to be the tradition, and I've stuck to that. Items are a very important part of a lot of fighting fantasy stories, perhaps even most of them. A lot of the time, you'll pick up lots and lots of items along the way, and whether you succeed or fail will often largely come down to whether you've picked the correct ones. There are some stories that this isn't true for, but on the whole, and perhaps especially in the fantasy themed stories, items are very important. Whether you have a particular item, whether you pick the right item out of sort of 4 or 5, makes the difference between sort of success and failure often. I don't think items are going to be as important in the story that I'm writing, but they are going to play at least some role, and so we do need to have a system for coding the fact that you can get items, and a separate system, although we don't need that yet. We need a system for checking whether the player has a particular item. So I'd like to spend the rest of the video demonstrating or talking about the code that allows that to happen. So here we are in the code. We're going to be looking at 3 pages today: initialize, main, and story caption. So we have a couple of new variables that we need to talk about. They are $IT and $IN. As usual, I'll zoom in a bit. $IT standing for item, I suppose, and $IN standing for item name. At the moment, there's only one item, so it seems it's probably a bit of overkill to sort of have 2 variables for this single item, but the point is, doing it this way allows us to add more items without having to add more code. So it's a little bit of complexity at the start, with the expectation that that will become worth it when we add more items later. So how does it work? Well, they're both arrays, and there's a little note here that says $IT square bracket excuse me, $IT square bracket $Z, n square bracket is set to 1 if the player character has item number Z. Names of items are stored in the $IN array. So in other words, if $IT5 is set to 0, that means you don't have, or the player character currently doesn't have whatever item 5 is when there is an item 5. If $IT5 has a value of 1, they do have that item. At the moment, 0 and 1 are the only possible values, but it would be quite easy if we had items such that you could have more than one of them. say, I don't know, you might collect smoke bombs or something. This is probably more of a fantasy thing, but you might collect smoke bombs and then you have the opportunity to use them. And of course, each time you use them, you lose one. So you might have a value of 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever in a particular slot of $IT. And that wouldn't require much change to the current code. But at the moment, we're assuming it's either 0 or 1. In other words, each item is a single thing that you can only ever have one of. $IN is a text array, and as I often do, I made slot 0. I just put the text null, and then slot 1 I had feathered staff. I find it a bit confusing to start from item 0. A lot of the time I find it more intuitive to start from item 1, and so I often just sort of ignore slot 0, put null in slot 0 to indicate that we're starting from 1. So let's look at the part of the main, I suppose what's becoming the main array, $S, the array that sort of stores the text and the code for each section. Let's have a look at the paragraph. Sorry, they're not really paragraphs. Let's have a look at the section where you gain an item. It's fairly straightforward. We have the text, as usual. We have 14, which is the code for this is gaining an item. And the next number is which item it is. Well, there's only one item, so it's obviously going to be item 1. And then as usual, the last entry in the list is which paragraph we go to once we've added that item. Now, of course, it may be the case that we need to have code for losing items. Sometimes that's the case in Fighting Fantasy. Often you just sort of collect lots of items. There may be some that are used up, destroyed by being used. But so far we haven't done that. But I'll show you the code when that happens. And of course, we also need code to test whether the player has a given item, because there's no point having the player collect all these items if there's never any difference in the game whether they have the item or not. You can have a couple of items that are sort of red herrings. Like often you might have, maybe you have 10 items and sort of, 6 or 7 of them, maybe 3 of them you need to actually finish the game, and maybe 4 of them will give you some advantage in combat or something when you choose to use them. And then maybe the other 3 are just red herrings. They seem like they're going to be useful, but they're not. And the player has to sort of work out through trial and error that, oh, well, actually there isn't any use for these items. But of course, you want most of them to not be red herrings. So we're going to need some code for that. Let's have a look at the code that I've written for using an item, and then I'll show you how the code will work for losing an item and for testing whether the player has an item. I haven't written them yet, but I know how they're going to work, and they're quite simple, so I can just do that in a few minutes. So here we are at number 14. It's very, very straightforward code. If $S, $A1 is equal to 14, then, as the note says, it's gain an item. So we have this quite complicated bit of code. Set $IT, square bracket, $S, square bracket, $A, n square bracket 2, n square bracket equal to 1. Set A equal to $S, $A3, and include main. So let's deal with this. So let's deal with it one bit at a time. So it's some slot of the IT array. We remember that that the IT array is the array that keeps track of which items you have, if any. And which item it is stored in $S, $A2. So $S is the array that we were just looking at. $A is the current section that you're in, that the player is in a given run of the game. We look at slot 2. In this case, that can only have a value of 1, of course, because there's only one item. But when there are more of them, obviously it will be able to have different values. So we look at that. We look at $S A2. We see that that's 1, and so therefore we say, all right, we're going to set IT1 equal to 1. And then, having looked at $S A2, we look at $S A3, and we set A to the value of what's sitting in there, because that's the paragraph that we go to once we gain the item, and then we include main. So let me show you how losing an item would work. Well, it would be the format would be identical, except that we'd have a different number. So let's say 15. The note would be different. It would say lose an item, and we'd set that to 0. Simple as that. It would have exactly the same format. It would have the text of the paragraph, then it would have the number 14 or 15, then it would have the item that we're talking about, and then it would have the paragraph to go to after we've done it. It would be identical code, except that we're not setting that item to 1, we're setting it to 0. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, what if we want to test whether the player has an item? Well, in that case, the format needs to be slightly different. We'd probably have something like this. And this would be in the S. Actually, I'll do it on the other page so it's sort of where it would actually be. So we'll, oops, sorry, I went to the wrong page. Let's go to this one. So we find the S array. This is the S array. Let's say it's here. And let's say that 16 is the number that we end up using for this. This is testing whether we have a given item. So we'd say, let's say no text, but there could be text, but either way, we have 16. We have, let's say we want to test whether the player has item 1. And then we'd have 2 paragraphs, and it would simply be go to this one, go to slot 3 if the player has that item, and go to slot 4 if the player doesn't have that item. And if the item is one which is sort of used up, 1Z1 might involve losing the item. It might have some sort of text like, oops. Let's say that item 2 is a smoke bomb. We might have something like, you throw the smoke bomb and run away in the confusion, right? Just some sort of obvious text like that. And then we'd have 15, meaning lose the item, lose item 2, and then go to 1Z3 or whatever it might be. So that is the format that we will use for testing whether the character has a given item. All right, so the last thing we need to look at is the fact that when you have an item, it displays that fact in the sidebar. So this is pretty straightforward. We go to the sidebar. As you remember, the sidebar first prints the Fighting Fantasy logo, and then if we're at the stage where we're ready for this to happen, it prints the skill, stamina, and luck of the character. Then if we have a respect attribute, it prints that, respect, colon, and then $H, which is where that attribute or that variable is stored. And that's all done in a table. And then we just simply add this for loop at the end of the table. So we have a for loop that goes from 1, and now I should say we're using the variable $SB because the way the sidebar works is it will execute after the main page has executed, but it uses the same set of variables. So if I use $Z in here, or $Y or X or whatever, that would be the same $Z, $Y or $X as is used in the main page. There aren't two sets of variables that can have the same name. $Z refers to the same variable. So if I did something with Z here, that might change its value. And if I want $Z to stay the same from one page to the next, that might cause a change in the variables. It might give the variables values that I don't want them to have. So to avoid that, we have this special variable $SB, which of course stands for sidebar, which is only used in the sidebar. And it's the only one that is used in the sidebar. If we needed another variable, we might put SB2 or something like that. So we have a sort of completely different, the variables in the sidebar aren't used anywhere else. And that way, whatever we do here can't accidentally muck up what we're doing in the main page. So we use this $SB. We have a for loop. It goes from 1 to $IT length, i.e. from 1 to the number of entries in the $IT array. And because the highest, well, it's not exactly the number of entries in the IT. It is actually the highest. It's based on the highest slot that is given a value. So at the moment, the highest slot that can be given a value is 1, of course. It's in fact the only slot that can be given a value. But if there are other items that we can get, well, obviously higher slots can have a value than currently. And so this will go up, $IT length will increase to cover that. In other words, just go through all the slots of IT. That's really sort of effectively what it's saying. And if $IT square bracket $SBN square bracket is equal to 1, that means the player has that item. So therefore, start a new, essentially, paragraph, which is aligned to the center. And the text of that paragraph is slot $SB of the array $IN. $IN is the names of the arrays. So in this case, it will print feathered staff. And when there's more items, if the player has them, it will print their names as well. And so that tells you what items, if any, your character has, which is, of course, an important part of a game like this. Okay, so that is items. We've only done getting the items, but I've also shown you how losing an item and how testing whether the player has an item will work. The next thing I'm probably going to do, I think, is money. Obviously, money is a sort of item, but it's, I think, worth treating it separately, because money works in a sort of slightly different way, I suppose, than items do. There's slightly more things that you can do with it than you can do with it. There are certain things you can do with it that sort of don't make sense with items, I guess. So I've decided to treat it as a separate thing. But for now, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.